This episode of Wait in the Wings is brought to you by viewers like you.
Imagine this. It's 1889 and you're in Paris.
Oh.
You're strolling through the World's Fair with a baguette and a cigarette.
Wait.
No, I don't care if you don't smoke or if you're allergic to gluten. Just go with it. It's important to the immersion. While walking the grounds, you come across a dark red poster with a stagecoach fleeing from horseback enemies in hot pursuit. 4 words pop off the page. Buffalo Bill's Wild West. In the late 1880s, Buffalo Bill's Wild West, or just the Wild West for short, was one of the largest entertainment spectacles in the world. It sold out 30,000-seat arenas, dominated newspapers, and played to farmers and queens alike. The Wild West was as if a circus, a rodeo, and medieval times had a baby. A baby that perpetuated manifest destiny. Every Buffalo Bill show staged over-the-top, often very flawed Old West stories. In the Paris Amphitheater, one stagecoach swerves out of control. Its roof ablaze, people chasing on both sides. Yet, you and the audience are just bored. You don't get why all these men are pretending to be cowboys. Then, a short girl steps forward, picks up a shotgun, and the arena erupts with gunfire. After a tour de force performance, the girl politely bows and skips backstage before coming out for 6 encores. You've probably heard of her.
Bullseye! Annie Oakley hits the entertainment bullseye every week with her straight shooting.
The greatest American markswoman of all time.
Miss Annie Oakley!
For nearly 140 years, she's been immortalized on everything from lunchboxes to comic books. But her most famous portrayal was this.
Ethel Merman stars in Irving Berlin's Annie, Get Your Gun, the story of Annie Oakley, the pride of Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, with Irving Berlin's most magic musical score.
The 1946 Broadway musical about a backcountry hunter turned Western superstar is a go-to for community theaters and high schools. But this isn't Annie Oakley. The real story of Annie Oakley was even more remarkable than you can imagine. And much like Buffalo Bill's Wild West, the difference between reality and fantasy isn't as clear as you might think. This is a look at how a young woman from Ohio somehow became a Wild West icon, about separating the person from the myth. All to answer the question, who the heck was Annie Oakley? This is my Western outfit. The Wild West was built on legends. Crazy Horse, Wild Bill Hickok, Calamity Jane, and who can forget our main boy, Potato Creek Johnny. Now, all of these people lived real lives, but they also all morphed into folk icons thanks to cheap novels and popular movies. But Annie Oakley's Wild West legend didn't start in some musty saloon or dusty mining town. It started in Ohio. Traveling acts were all the rage in the 1800s. They were essentially the TikTok of the time. Only instead of swiping up to see the next ridiculous thing on your phone, you'd just wait for it to pull into town on a wagon. One week, you'd watch Doc Carver's high-diving horses. The next, you'd see a man shoot himself out of a cannon. In 1880, Frank Butler pulled into town. A man with a mustache that screamed, "I live in the 1800s." Butler was a sharpshooter on variety stages. His most popular trick involved shooting an apple off the head of his trusty partner, George. George was his poodle. Staying near Cincinnati, Butler took a $100 bet from an innkeeper to face a local marksman. Not only would winning get more people to see his show, it would also give him some much-needed cash. On the day of the shooting match, Butler claims he arrived late and found the whole town waiting. He scanned the crowd to find his opponent, only for his eyes to settle on a short girl with chestnut hair and blue-gray eyes. As detailed in Courtney Riley Cooper's biography, Frank asked,
"Who's that pretty little country girl?"
To which someone responded, "The one you're to shoot against." Before there was Annie Oakley, there was Phoebe Ann Mosey, though most people still called her Annie. After her father froze to death, Annie's family fell into extreme poverty, and she began hunting to provide for them. The main legend goes that she took her first shot at 8 years old, grabbing her father's old Kentucky rifle off the fireplace and shooting a squirrel clean off of a fence to eat. Another version says her brother overloaded the gun, hoping the kick would make her stop talking about shooting. The kick might have broken her nose, but she shot clean through her brother's hat.
My mother was perfectly horrified when I began shooting and tried to keep me in school, but I would run away and go quail shooting in the woods.
According to Cooper's biography, firing head-on quickly bored Annie. Wandering in the forest, she challenged herself to get fancy with her shots. Soon, she was shooting birds while running and spinning around. Now she stood across from the first real showman she'd ever met, ready to beat Frank Butler and walk away with some of the prize money. In a world where animal conservation was only beginning to be understood, the contest involved shooting real birds. Whoever killed the most won. As Butler later recalled,
"I was a beaten man the moment she appeared, for I was taken off guard. I never shot better in my life, but never did a person make more impossible shots than did that little girl. She killed 23 and I killed 21. It was her first big match, my first defeat."
Whoever said you can't get a man with a gun didn't know Annie, because she won much more than a shooting match that day. She won Frank Butler's heart. In the musical Annie, Get Your Gun, it takes the whole show and who knows how many in-show years for the two to actually get together. Not married, mind you, literally just to admit they dig each other. In reality, it only took a couple of months. After he lost the match, Frank invited Annie to watch him perform before he left town. He must have seemed larger than life to someone who never left Darke County, Ohio. The costumes, the scenery, the makeup, the props, everything captivated the 20-year-old girl who only ever thought of shooting as a means of survival. Following the show, she promised to keep in touch, but only through letters she sent to Frank's poodle, George. The jury is out on when Annie and Frank actually got married, but it's known that she left Ohio with him a year after their match. That's when her life changed forever.
I told you to put her name up someplace, not to make a star out of her. That's ridiculous. She's only doing a couple of little tricks, isn't she?
Contrary to how he's presented in pretty much any media involving Annie Oakley, Frank Butler was the furthest thing from a narcissistic jerk. I don't think he ever thought that anything she could do, he could do better. He was a sympathetic man with a love for poetry and a profound respect for his wife. So, you know, the exact opposite of any character Howard Keel played in a movie. Annie set shooting to the side after their marriage to focus on getting an education. But in 1882, the world pulled her back in. Frank Butler's shooting partner, John Graham, became ill. Needing someone to handle the props, Butler turned to his wife. It's said that Butler shot pretty poorly that night. He missed shot after shot until someone in the crowd yelled, "Let the girl shoot!" She missed the first shot, but hit every one that followed. John Graham was immediately out of a job. Annie took his place.
The crowd went into an uproar, and when I attempted to resume my act, I was howled down, and Annie continued. From that day to this, I have not competed with her in public shooting. She outclassed me. I didn't teach her to shoot because she could have taught me even then. I simply got her a position, and she did the rest.
Pinpointing the moment when Phoebe Ann Mosey became Annie Oakley is like trying to pinpoint the exact moment when Walter White became Heisenberg in Breaking Bad. Only much harder because record keeping in the 1800s was more scarce than compliance with child labor laws. The decision to change her last name ranges from a neighborhood in Cincinnati to the name of a friendly stranger on a train. When Annie was 9, she was sent to live at the county poor farm, called the Infirmary. Since kids were treated like used cars back then, a local farmer got a good deal on Annie and hired her to look after his newborn child and keep his wife company. Friendly at first, once they left the infirmary, the wolf in sheep's clothing revealed itself.
Yeah, she would never say who they were. You know, she just called them the he-wolf and the she-wolf.
This is Shirl Kasper, the go-to historian of Annie Oakley and the author of her biography. A truly great read and a key resource for this video. I'll put a link in the description.
Well, she writes about it in her autobiography, how they abused her and made her work so hard, and she fell asleep one day over some darning and they threw her out into the snow.
I got up at 4 o'clock in the morning, got breakfast, milked the cows, washed dishes, skimmed milk, fed the calves and pigs, pumped water for the cattle, fed the chickens, rocked the baby to sleep, weeded the garden, picked wild blackberries, and got dinner.
Since Annie could hardly read or write, there was no way to reach her mom, who kept writing to ask her to come home. After 2 years of abuse, Annie finally escaped and told her story to the first man who listened. The kind stranger gave her enough money to get her to the end of the line. Where she went from there was up to her.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Buffalo Bill Cody, and today, for your entertainment pleasure, we're going to show you the American West as it really was and never will be again.
In the 1960s, America came down with Beatlemania. In the 1880s, it came down with Billomania and tuberculosis. One of the biggest personalities to come out of the American frontier, Colonel Buffalo Bill Cody did it all. Pony Express rider, Army Scout, Buffalo Hunter. He was tall, distinguished, and as many biographers strangely love to point out, dude looked great on a horse. Annie Oakley and Frank Butler first met Buffalo Bill in 1884. When their paths crossed in New Orleans. As Annie and Frank dealt with the fallout of the Sells Brothers Circus canceling their run early, Buffalo Bill prepared to set up the Wild West for a 3-month stand. Out of a job, the duo asked to join the troupe. Buffalo Bill turned them down on the spot. He already had a sharpshooter act, and a famous one at that. The crack shot Captain Bogardus, who once broke a record by shooting 500 pigeons in 528 minutes. Why? Because he was Captain Bogardus, damn it! With no room on Bill's bill, Annie and Frank left New Orleans empty-handed. Later that week, Wild West business manager Nate Salsbury got a telegram from Buffalo Bill.
Outfit at bottom of river. What do you advise?
In a miraculous twist of fate, the steamboat carrying Buffalo Bill Cody's show collided head-on with another boat and sank to the bottom of the Mississippi River, taking the show's props, animals, and Captain Bogardus's guns with it. The crash resulted in the Wild West losing $60,000 and the talent of Captain Bogardus. He didn't die. He was just really upset that he lost his guns, so he quit. Hearing the news, Annie requested a tryout. Buffalo Bill doubted that Annie could handle the kickback of the shotgun and worried her salary demands were too high. Still, he agreed to let her audition in Louisville, Kentucky. Annie showed up to the ballpark while Buffalo Bill rode his horse in the show's welcoming parade. And you bet he looked great doing it. The only person in the park was an onlooker in a derby hat. Wasting no time to practice, Frank Butler started throwing glass balls in the air for Annie to shoot at. She practiced every trick in her act. She shot her gun upside down, shot a target using a knife as a mirror. She even shot while leaning backwards. When all was said and done, the man in the derby hat ran to Annie, shouting,
"Fine, wonderful. Have you a photograph? Something with your gun? My name is Nate Salsbury. I'm Buffalo Bill's partner."
The question of salary was no concern to Salsbury. He needed Annie Oakley.
There I was facing the real Wild West. The first white woman to travel with what society might have considered an impossible outfit.
And Frank just steps aside, which is amazing. He just supports her and, becomes her sidekick, really. Loading her guns and her ammunition and promoting her big time. There would be no Annie without Frank, really.
But Annie Oakley wasn't the biggest star to join the Wild West that year. Not by a long shot. There's a scene in Annie Get Your Gun where Annie Oakley meets Chief Sitting Bull for the first time after he watched her in the Wild West show. Sitting Bull runs in yelling and chasing her while Annie runs away from him. In reality, when Sitting Bull joined Buffalo Bill's show in 1885, Annie had already met him before, and it definitely didn't play out like that. Or like this. The two first met in St. Paul, Minnesota the year before. Many regarded Sitting Bull as one of the most infamous prisoners of war in America. A Hunkpapa Lakota chief, Sitting Bull united more than 7,000 Lakota, Arapaho, and Cheyenne to defeat General George Armstrong Custer's cavalry in the Battle of Little Bighorn.
There were 709 Americans killed. We counted 707 carbines. 2 might have fallen in the creek.
Even though Sitting Bull didn't engage in combat at Little Bighorn, he was still blamed for the murder of Custer. Sitting Bull eventually surrendered to the US government in return for a full pardon to him and his tribe. That's when they tried to assimilate him to white civilization. In 1884, Sitting Bull attended a theater where Frank Butler and Annie Oakley were performing. She shot backwards using a mirror to aim and straight through the middle of an Ace of Hearts playing card. She even shot an apple off George's head. He was so taken with her skill that he kept requesting to meet Annie in person. Annie turned him down, not out of spite or fear, but because she was busy competing in shooting matches to make ends meet.
A messenger came down bringing $65, which Sitting Bull sent me as the price of one of my photographs since I wouldn't come myself. This amused me, so I sent him back his money and a photograph with it, with all my love and a message to say that I would call the following morning.
The next day, Annie Oakley greeted Sitting Bull, who insisted on her becoming an honorary member of his tribe. She agreed, and he gave her the Lakota name
Watanya Cecilia looked a sure shot.
A year later, Sitting Bull voluntarily decided to join Buffalo Bill's Wild West.
People say, oh, he joined because of Annie Oakley. And it's probably more that he needed some money, like $50, he'd sell his photos. But he did know her, and It is documented that when she saw him, she went up and said hello, and he said hello.
Did you get the red silk handkerchief and coins I sent?
I got them, but left them at home for safety. I am very glad to see you. I have not forgotten you, and feel pleased that you want to remember me.
In the late 1800s, Buffalo Bill's Wild West was one of the few places indigenous people could find gainful employment and live outside the strict confines of the reservation system. That said, they still had to endure the trope of civilization defeating the savages and perform to boos and hisses every day. In between shows, it's said that Sitting Bull would spend time in Annie's tent, watching her sew, crochet, and read from her Bible. A far cry from the bloodthirsty guy people made him out to be. Eventually, the care and respect between the two grew so great that Sitting Bull gifted Annie the moccasins he wore in the Battle of Little Bighorn. They were made by his daughter, who died shortly after the conflict. He asked Annie if she would take her place as his daughter. Annie, who never really had a dad, would refer to Sitting Bull as her adopted father for the rest of her life. The year Annie Oakley and Sitting Bull joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West, the show experienced its first profitable season ever. Annie's act evolved. She learned how to spin a rope and ride a horse Western style. Her costumes became a mix of Victorian modesty and Old West flair.
She would skip into the arena, blowing kisses, and then when she would miss a shot, she'd stamp her foot. She incorporates humor and pantomime into her act. She was an actress.
Before long, the season ended and Sitting Bull prepared to return home. He had seen the country, sent money home to his wives, and met President Cleveland. In a show of respect, Buffalo Bill gifted Sitting Bull the gray horse he rode that was trained to dance at the sound of gunfire. As Annie packed up, Sitting Bull visited her tent to say goodbye. Cooper claims that after exchanging gifts, the two stepped into the rain together. Sitting Bull looked ahead and stated,
"It will be a cold winter."
5 years later, he was killed by Lakota tribal police during an attempt to arrest him. Legend says that at the sound of the gunfire, his horse started to dance. Unlike other performers of the time, Annie Oakley rarely wore her heart on her sleeve. When asked of Sitting Bull in an interview years later, she simply said,
Poor Sitting Bull. He was a true friend to me.
She quickly changed the subject back to sharpshooting.
Annie, these belong to you.
No. You want them, you keep them.
We're gonna be partners.
Partners? Oh, Frank.
Okay, so the ending of Annie Get Your Gun makes zero sense from a historical standpoint. The whole musical focuses on this rivalry between Annie and Frank, with Annie throwing a match just so Frank will love her again. This feud never happened. Her real-life competition was Lillian Frances Smith. After witnessing Annie's success, Buffalo Bill recruited more female performers. This included Smith, who he met at her father's shooting gallery. Annie Oakley and Lillian Smith couldn't have been more different. Oakley was humble and modest, dressed in proper Victorian outfits, while Smith was boastful and wore provocative costumes. Conflict started right away when word spread that Smith, or maybe her manipulative father, declared,
"Now that I'm with the Wild West, Annie Oakley, she's done for."
Worried the 15-year-old Smith made her seem less youthful, 26-year-old Annie moved up her birth date from 1860 to 1866, making her a spry 20-year-old again.
It's her one lie, and she will tell that lie forever and ever and ever.
It was an understandable lie, however, and one told to protect her career. Little Missy knew her star was rising and wasn't about to let the California girl steal the spotlight. After a bug trapped in her eardrum brought Annie close to death, she ignored doctor's orders and rode more than 50 blocks in a parade on horseback, smiling and waving through a brutal fever. She was bedridden for 4 days with blood poisoning.
But I think it's important because it just shows how worried she must have been about Lillian taking over the spotlight, that she would, even though she didn't feel good, she was going to definitely be in that parade.
The heated rivalry between Annie Oakley and Lillian Smith peaked in London. In 1867, a steamship carrying 200 performers, 180 horses, and a stagecoach journeyed to London for Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee, the 50th anniversary of her reign. The celebration drew royalty from across the globe, all eager to see Buffalo Bill's Wild West, which was quickly becoming the talk of the town. Oakley and Smith shot in front of prime ministers, princes, dukes, and emperors. But in the battle of society, Annie won.
She's accepted by the elite society and is invited to their gun clubs. All these gentlemen and elite socialites, she's so soft-spoken, so feminine, so whatever. They like her. And so she becomes really popular. And then when Americans hear that she's a big hit in London, it comes back to America. And yeah, that's where she really, really becomes famous, I think.
The highest honor came when Queen Victoria came out of mourning for the first time in 30 years just to attend the Wild West. After watching the show, she called for the 2 American girls to greet her at the royal box.
She finished by saying, "You are a very, very, very clever little girl." To be called clever by Queen Victoria meant the highest compliment. And with a "I thank you, Your Majesty," I bowed myself out.
Lillian Smith curtsied and showed off her rifle. Much to Annie's annoyance, she was left out of the sketch featured in the Illustrated London News. Lillian Smith appeared front and slightly off-center. As the competition for attention continued, Annie and Frank read a letter in the American publication Breeder and Sportsman that claimed Lillian Smith was knocking the English shooters crazy. It spoke of her being presented to the world's nobility and that Annie Oakley was being, quote, left out in the cold. The letter was simply signed a Californian, a name lost to time, but was most likely Lillian Smith or her husband. Immediately, Frank Butler and Nate Salsbury wrote their own angry replies. One person who didn't reply? Buffalo Bill. The rift in London involved not just Oakley and Smith, but also Buffalo Bill. Invited to shoot with Annie at Britain's Rifle Association, he didn't show. This sparked rumors that he feared losing, with one newspaper even claiming,
"We notice that Miss Annie Oakley is carrying off the majority of the honors. The news says her marksmanship is better than Buffalo Bill's."
Whatever the reason, be it the feud with Smith, Buffalo Bill's jealousy, or a desire to perform on her own, Annie and Frank quietly left the show after London. In less than a year, Annie turned Pawnee Bill's Wild East from a struggling Wild West show into a commercial success, while ticket sales for Buffalo Bill's Wild West started to drop. Getting off his high horse, Buffalo Bill renegotiated Annie's contract. Some believe Annie would only come back if Lillian Smith left. The terms were met, and Annie Oakley rejoined Buffalo Bill's Wild West in 1889, just in time for the World's Fair in Paris. Annie Oakley is a legend. She's been immortalized in movies, cartoons, and a miniseries, yet little footage exists of the real woman. Most people only know of this 1894 film from Thomas Edison. If you can even call it a film, it's like 30 seconds. But a lesser known 1922 clip shows her resilience and stubbornness at age 62. She shoots as precisely as she did at 15, despite surviving a train accident and a massive libel lawsuit where she sued 55 newspapers. At her peak, Annie Oakley was the most famous woman alive. But today, a lot of people don't know who she was. If anything, she's mainly known as a love-struck heroine in Annie Get Your Gun. There's an old Western quote that says, "When the legend becomes fact, print the legend." That's the paradox of Annie Oakley and all Wild West legends. Yes, even you, Potato Creek Johnny. Their stories are rooted in reality, but countless retellings have turned them into myths. But maybe that fantasy is why legends never die. We want to believe in the extraordinary. The thing is, even Annie Oakley's ordinary was extraordinary. She was a contradiction. She was a poor girl from Ohio who became a Western folk hero. She was someone who used her fame to help orphans and advocate for women, yet believed women didn't need to vote. She was modest but confident, sweet but a dead shot, soft-spoken but show-stopping. Through it all, she seemed to live by one truth: there's no business like show business. It's remarkable how even though Annie Oakley was really the first female superstar in America, she wasn't really what you would call a diva. I think that honor goes to Patti LuPone. What a segue that was. Click on this video to learn more about the amazing feud between the wild casting drama behind Sunset Boulevard and how Andrew Lloyd Webber lost $1 million in a matter of seconds. And remember to support the channel on Patreon to help us keep making these documentaries.